So they can't really get beyond Trump. And so in DeSantis' case, he's trying to out-Trump Trump by becoming the most violent thug possible. Without Trump, we would not have a DeSantis who said, on day one, we're going to be slitting throats. I mean, who says that? Who says that? The people I study. Right. The Putins. Putin talked about slitting throats, or these junta leaders.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aaron Rupar Show. Today, I'm going to be joined by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth is one of the country's foremost experts on authoritarianism. She's a professor at New York University. She recently authored a book called Strongman that really unpacks 20th century authoritarianism through the lens of strongmen. She talks about everybody from Putin to Orban to military coups in Africa. So it's a great book. And she also shares a lot of her research and her scholarship in more kind of short form writing on her Substack called Lucid. She actually had a piece just earlier this week on how strongmen do not debate, kind of putting that in the context of Trump here in the States, who is not participating in tonight's Fox News debate, the very first one of the Republican cycle. And so she and I do get into that a little bit, but we also kind of take more of a zoom out, talk about the factors that led to Trump's rise in the first place and how she foresees Trumpism ending, whether that be through a political means or a legal means. So before we get to that interview, I just want to also mention that next week I will be talking with Melissa Hortman. Melissa is the Speaker of the House here in Minnesota. So we will be talking about the Democratic trifecta here, some of the factors that she thinks accounts for the success that Democrats have had in a state that not so long ago was regarded as being kind of purple, but now has really been dominated by Democrats for a generation. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'd love it if you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Please share the show with your friends, colleagues, family members to help spread the word. And let me also work in a plug here for my newsletter, Public Notice, where right now I'm offering free trials to all new signups. If you like the conversation that I have today with Ruth, kind of going deep on Trumpism and doing kind of a 30,000-foot view on American politics, I think you will really like my newsletter, which deals with these issues on a daily and weekly basis. Without further ado, though, let's get to my conversation with Ruth. Hello and welcome everyone to the Aaron Rupar Show. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Ruth is a professor at New York University with expertise on fascism and authoritarianism. She recently wrote a wonderful book called Strongmen that kind of traces the rise of strongmen throughout the 20th century in Europe, but also in Africa. And then it touches upon Trump as well. And she is also the author of a Substack called Lucid that kind of brings some of that same analytical framework to current events. You actually had a post up just yesterday kind of unpacking why it is that Trump is not debating. We're recording this earlier on Wednesday before tonight's highly anticipated first Republican debate. I'm actually not sure how highly anticipated it truly is. And we will get to a little bit of that later. But first off, Ruth, thanks for making some time this morning to chat.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, so I thought maybe a good place to start is just a little bit of your background, which when you began your career, you were writing a lot about specifically Italian fascism, Mussolini, and now you've kind of broadened your scholarship out to authoritarianism more broadly. But I'm curious, when did you first start getting a feeling that some of the scholarship you've done surrounding authoritarianism might become relevant in the American context? We've obviously been living with Trump as kind of a part of our politics here, front and center for almost a decade now. But when did you first start getting an inkling that, some of the research, just the thinking you brought to bear more globally would be relevant here in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I studied American history in high school, basically at school. And then I kind of switched to doing European things. And so, of course, I voted as a good citizen, paid attention to American politics, but I also was living in Italy for years. And so it was really when Trump came on the scene in 2015, and I saw video of him at a rally doing the loyalty oath with his followers. this this kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I realized that this seemed very familiar, that this person was very familiar, that he could be a demagogue, and the way he was speaking to the crowd, all of that. He reminded me of Berlusconi in Italy, who I had worked on. So that was it. And I was already writing for CNN, but only on historical things. But I had a foothold there. So I started to cover Trump, and I ended up covering the 2016 election. And that's how I got into all of the things I'm doing today.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, with the 2016 election, I was covering Trump at that time as well. Actually, the first job that I had in DC, which was for Think Progress, my very first day was Super Tuesday. And so like I got on the, I started covering the stuff right when Trump started consolidating the Republican nomination and became a serious presidential contender. But even with that, covering him like I was doing at the time, I still kind of fell into that trap of assuming that ultimately Hillary Clinton would win. Watching those debates, I mean, I just couldn't wrap my mind around people, at scale voting for Trump. And then, of course, we had the Access Hollywood recording and everything that happened in that October. Did you, maybe with your background and expertise in authoritarianism, have a slightly different perspective on that? Or how seriously did you take Trump? Was he kind of more of this like novelty act that he was for a lot of people? One other just thing I want to mention in passing, as we talked just before the first Republican presidential debate, is I remember the Republican debates in 2015 being like these huge TV events. I mean, I remember going to a bar and watching the one where Megyn Kelly and Trump tangled, and then Trump later on had misogynistic remarks about her. But there was kind of this novelty to Trump at that time that it's hard to kind of remember now that we've experienced him as president and how grave the threat of his politics is. But what was your view on Trump back in 2016?
Yeah, so novel in the American context, but very familiar in other contexts. And so I saw him as this kind of demagogue, and two things really worried me very early. One was this was a huge red flag when he said in January 2016 that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and he wouldn't lose any followers. And from where I sit, this is what fascists do. This is what Duterte did, in the Philippines, where you associate yourself with violence. You signal to people that you approve of violence, you are personally capable of violence. And this is the kicker, and you're going to be loved and admired because of that violence. That's the wouldn't lose any followers part. So when I saw that, this is January 2016, I wrote a piece on Trump. I said, if he gets the nomination, which wasn't going to be for months, he will have a personality cult. And I used the examples of Putin and Berlusconi. Nobody wanted this piece because people were like, what are you talking about? He's just like a clown, right? We don't want to take him seriously. So I took him very seriously. I was very worried from the very start. And then I was tracking the GOP, because just 2 weeks after he said this, that's when Jeff Sessions, one of his earliest enablers, kind of endorsed him and showed up at one of his rallies and wore a MAGA hat, put a MAGA hat on. And that was the beginning of like the rapprochement between the GOP more seriously and Trump after he said he was violent. So that was another very bad sign.
Yeah. Zooming out even a little bit further here, also drawing from your research, I think when people think of like the rise of Nazism or of Soviet communism, the thought that a lot of people have in mind is that these were societies that were, in the midst of economic depression or major social upheaval, that had, factors at play in those societies that could help account for the appeal of like kind of these radical figures who were promising big changes with the past and kind of a whole different way of doing politics. Well, I think when we think of the United States in 2015 and 2016, it was a very different context where, under Obama, obviously, Obama took over coming out of the Great Recession, or that was actually the early days of his presidency, but a lot of the factors were in place when he took office. But the economy over those 8 years was pretty solid. The jobs market by the end of his term was good. The point simply being that the economy, was relatively strong. Society was relatively stable in those years. While, of course, there were factors we could point to that accounted for, people feeling alienated or global unrest, things like that. But what do you think accounts in the American context for the appeal of strongmen that's a little bit different than what we might think of in some of these historical examples?
Well, one of the things that was so interesting doing a book that goes over 100 years is you see patterns emerge. And the pattern is, when do these people have an appeal? And one of the commonalities is that it's when a society has gone through a lot of rapid social and political change, but especially social change, meaning you've had a lot of, could be racial emancipation, gender equity, workers' rights. After World War I, it was workers' rights and the threat of the left, of communism, whatever. But even in Spain, where even before you have a coup, it's you like in Spain in the 1930s, before Franco did his coup, women had just achieved a huge amount of economic independence. They had the right to inherit property. So that's one pattern. And we were set up perfectly for this because we just had 8 years of an African-American president that many people never accepted. They thought this was the end of the world. You also had a female candidate, of course, Hillary Clinton. But during Obama's time, same-sex marriage had been legalized because homophobia is a through line of authoritarianism. Women had been admitted to combat for the first time. In other countries, women had been in combat for a long time, but not in our country. So all these things had happened. And then you had a kind of, so you when it's in the Euro-American context, it's white males, but it's actually doesn't have to be in other areas of the world. It's when men feel their status and privilege are threatened. And again, it's white men. If you have, we're a multiracial democracy and people can't accept that. And Obama and everything that happened during his time symbolized this kind of, quote, wrong direction. And that's when somebody like Trump comes, on the scene and scans the political marketplace and says, oh, here's a constituency, white working class voters, malcontents. And so he brilliantly swooped in and he said, you are the forgotten. I love you and I'm going to save you. And so he created this big tent for all these people, all the extremists, all the disaffected, and it worked beautifully. But it's our turn. It was our turn to have this dynamic, and it looks different every time, right? But that's the general set of conditions that lead a population to embrace somebody like a Trump.
Yeah, so let's fast forward a little bit to the present day. And I mentioned at the top, we're recording this on Wednesday before the debate, but we kind of know how it's going to go, right? We saw DeSantis's memo from his super PAC, which basically encouraged him to defend Trump and attack some of the other candidates. We know, Vivek Ramaswamy is basically out there trying to defend Trump even harder than Trump defends himself. Tim Scott seems to want to avoid even mentioning Trump. Same thing with Nikki Haley. And so, we kind of have this bizarre primary that feels a lot more like a coronation than anything else. And actually, I had a newsletter item today that was authored by Noah Berlatsky that was just kind of, explaining how this debate is really going to be kind of the encapsulation of Trump's hostile takeover of the Republican Party, in the sense that Trump has humiliated the RNC, which really wanted him to debate. He refused to do it. He's humiliated Fox News, who enabled him for years and years, was the mouthpiece of his administration. And now not only is he refusing to debate, but he's actually counter-programming with a host that they just fired a few months ago under very fraught circumstances. And so, we're gearing up today to watch this bizarre debate, but none of the candidates are going to attack Trump, with the exception of some of the more fringe ones like Chris Christie, for instance. But how does your expertise in authoritarian systems kind of explain this dynamic that I think to normal people who haven't done the research like you have done or aren't immersed in these, historical examples as you are, seems very strange?
It's strange, but it's another symptom of Trump he has captured the GOP at, by the way, a dizzying speed. We're going to look back and it's absolutely extraordinary how fast he did this, because a lot of other leaders, like from Mussolini or Berlusconi, they created their own party. So they had an advantage. They were always going to be the cult leader. But, Trump had to come in and didn't even have a political background. And he still did this with great speed. So this whole thing is legible or understandable through authoritarian dynamics, because the fact that he's not there, for example, this authoritarians cannot really willingly be in debates, because the whole idea of debate is it's a democratic exercise. Everybody on stage is supposed to be equal, and they are bound by rules that they didn't make themselves. They have moderators, arbiters. It's like it's a set thing, and that's anathema to somebody like Trump. His whole cult is that he's the leader cult. He's the man above all other men. He not only doesn't obey the rules, that's part of his charm, right? He's the rogue, but he bends the rules to suit him. So he can't really, without tarnishing his brand, he can't really participate in the debate. And in fact, in 2016, you mentioned when Megyn Kelly grilled him, what did he do? He boycotted the next debate.
Right.
Because ironically, these quote strongmen, they're afraid of looking weak. And so I just published a piece in my Substack yesterday called Demagogues Don't Debate. And it shows how Putin refused to debate, and also Viktor Orban no longer debates because they don't want to be subject to questioning. That's the final part of this, especially somebody under indictment, but they're all corrupt and they don't want anybody to be questioning them in public. So for all those reasons, but his shadow will be there. And the field of this very strange field of candidates we have just testifies to how much he's transformed the Republican Party.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move ahead even a little bit further here, because I'm sure you're aware, as most people are, that polling of Biden and Trump, we're, a ways out at this point, but it's pretty much neck and neck. I mean, despite Trump being indicted 4 times over, and I think Biden has a relatively strong record to run on this, next year, but it looks like it's going to be another nail biter, and maybe that's not a surprise given just how polarized the electorate is at this point. But you have written a bit recently about kind of what people should be thinking about and expecting if Trump returns to the White House. You had a piece recently for MSNBC writing that, this plan that he's put forth, very authoritarian plan to reshape the federal government is, and I'm going to just read a sentence from your piece. You wrote, quote, consistent with the 21st century playbook for authoritarians, tell the public how you set up an authoritarian state well before you get into office, end quote. You also wrote that, quote, this is from a different piece, I believe, but, quote, Trump won't leave the White House if he returns to the presidency, since he will quickly do what he needs to do to make himself beyond prosecution, end quote. So very broadly, what do you think people should be bracing themselves for as we start to think more seriously about the possibility of a second Trump term?
Yeah, so it's so easy to not take people like Trump seriously. And all of these guys, because they're full of bluster and they are clownish, but the clownish is by design. It's easy to think that when he says, I'm going to destroy the deep state, what does that look like? Like, what would that mean? But Trump has an army of people. And this New York Times article that came out about, the plans that they have to kind of, it's called autocratic capture, to kind of take over the judiciary, especially because that's part of the playbook. If you have legal problems, you've got to focus on reforming, cleansing the judiciary so that you will be free of problems forever. And that's what Netanyahu is doing. He's trying to do in Israel, and there are all the protests because of that. That's part of the playbook. But I was very alarmed in that New York Times article. There was a quote by one of this army of operatives he's got planning this out, the former head of his Office of Management and Budget. And this man said, we're looking for pockets of independence to seize them. And so, he will do a widespread purge of the civil service, of agencies of the federal government, including the judiciary. But pockets of independence to be seized, that's the definition of autocratic capture, where you fire everybody who's not going to be a loyalist. And by the way, Trump already did this. And I think that many Americans have not reckoned with how much damage he caused in his first term, to the Department of State, to the EPA. I mean, these were like hostile takeovers back then. So he would accelerate this. So that's one thing. The other thing we could expect is a kind of acceleration of what he tried to do when he first came in. And this was kind of a shock to the state. I remember Kellyanne Conway saying, this is the shock to the system. When he came in and he had the executive order for the so-called Muslim travel ban, right? And it was implemented in a chaotic way on purpose. TSA was not prepared. And this was the announcement that they were going to have a kind of authoritarian shock troop, blitzkrieg. So we could expect that, and he has a team working on this, to be implemented, but in a far greater fashion, because this time he's prepared. He wasn't really prepared last time. And he had Steve Bannon as his main strategist. And Steve Bannon is an ideologue, but he's a bit chaotic. This time he's got the former head of the Management and Budget Office. These are bureaucrats who know how to get things done.
Yeah, and I believe that gentleman's name is Russ Voigt, right?
Russell. Yes, exactly.
Yes. And I believe the plan that you're referring to, at least part of it, is the Schedule F proposal, which would basically give Trump new powers to fire civil servants kind of really without cause, right? Or for kind of being ideologically bad fits with him, which previously that has been a degree of protection that civil servants have had that has allowed them to serve across different administrations.
Yes, there's that. And the other thing is, I wouldn't, this is somebody, Trump, who has said he would, like to terminate parts of the Constitution or whatever. I think that we could expect some kind of trumped up way to declare a state of emergency. I've written about that for MSNBC. Autocrats love states of emergency because it allows them to have the definition of authoritarianism. The executive can expand its powers. And he's just, thirsting after that. Which is why, by the way, the House passed the Protecting Our Democracies Act, and it didn't pass the Senate. But it very prominent in this is our protections against presidents abusing their emergency powers. And they did this in reaction to knowing what Trump might try to do if he got a second term.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was one of the big worries even on January 6th, that, had leftist protesters been more active on January 6th, it might have given Trump, that sort of pretext to declare a state of emergency. And God knows what would have happened from there, if he could have gotten the military more involved or something like that. So, it was something that was even kind of floating around that we saw in the most recent federal indictment for January 6th, where John Eastman and other people that Trump, that had Trump's ear, were talking very openly about invoking the Insurrection Act, which would have given, Trump powers to use the military to quell protests had he just said the election was fraudulent and therefore, we're kicking it back to these state legislatures, and they said I won, so I win. So it was something that was being talked about, a worst case scenario that thankfully did not come to fruition.
Yeah. And that would certainly, there's two things to that. One, very interesting 21st century development, because a third of my book is about military coups. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think at the time it would be so relevant to the States, like studying coups. But what happens today, both with Trump and January 6th, and then the copycat insurrection of Bolsonaro on January 8th, if you can't get the military to play your game, you have already gotten together a kind of civilian army of thugs. So Trump's been doing this since 2015, signaling to extremists. And so you can rely on civilian army. And in our country, it's particularly dangerous because we have so many militias and our gun policies. There's so many armed civilians. And so that's the new playbook. But in this case, if you recall, around the time of Lafayette Square, when Trump was, repressing the Black Lives Matter protests, he staged this terrifying authoritarian spectacle where he flooded the streets of Washington with all of these unmarked troops. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
He had he had hundreds of people, and he called out kind of, troops that people didn't even know existed, like security forces, like for the post office. And a lot of them were unmarked. And I, having studied, Latin American juntas, I was very scared about this. This is the kind of thing that was rehearsing something he could do in the future. So that's another area. So you've got the bureaucracy capture, the judiciary in particular, and then you've got the use of force, be it paramilitary, be it civilian, be it the actual array of armed forces and law enforcement available to him.
Yeah. And meanwhile, in the background of all of this are the various indictments that Trump has been hit with, 2 federal ones, the New York one and the Georgia one. Of course, tomorrow Trump will be on Thursday. Trump will be down in Georgia being booked into jail and arraigned on the charges that he faces down there. How confident are you that the American justice system is capable of holding Trump accountable? And kind of the reason that I ask this is because even with the first federal indictment that's being handled down in South Florida, I mean, the judge presiding over this case is a very thinly qualified Trump appointee, and she's already indicated in some of her rulings in the case that she's willing to kind of put her thumb on the scale for Trump. Now, there's a different situation in the second one in the DC court with an Obama nominee who seems to be, she's been historically more tough on the January 6th defendants. And, it seems like she's kind of driving a more hard bargain there, at least being more fair than Judge Cannon down in Florida is. But, I guess my default after nearly a decade of covering Trump is that it's like that famous tweet, let's see how Donnie wriggles his way out of this one. And then he does. I mean, it just seems like he's really good at avoiding any sort of consequences for his actions. But what's your take on that? Do you think that the justice system is capable of holding him accountable?
I do. Ultimately, you're right that that he wriggles his way out of things, and people who study authoritarians, it's like there's the phrase Teflon Don, but Silvio Berlusconi, he had over 20 indictments by the time he left office involuntarily, and he was finally convicted of like 6 different things 2 years after he left office. And here's the thing: then he was banned. He was banned for running for office for 5 years. And the same thing has happened to Bolsonaro. He's now banned. He was, they got him on election fraud, right? Or propagating election fraud. And then they banned him until 2030. And this is very important for people who have a cult like Trump, because once they can no longer be, the head of state, just they're legally banned, they lose relevance pretty quickly. And that was the one thing that did it in Berlusconi's case. He did all the things Trump is doing, delaying, running out the clock and all these things. He did them too, and he did them very successfully. But I'm very heartened by the resoluteness of the American justice system, and not only Jack Smith's office, but we also see that there are Trump-appointed judges, like the judge who who dismissed Trump's suit against CNN. And a piece of my writing was cited as example number 1 in that, along all the other people were CNN, full-time employees, and then there was me. That was a Trump appointee. And there's numerous cases of Trump appointees who have, stood up for the rule of law. So we shall see.
Yeah. One of the chapters of your book deals with the ending of these strongmen. You talk about, the demise that Gaddafi experienced, obviously, in Libya. You've talked about Berlusconi, some of the circumstances surrounding the end of his political career. I'm sure kind of like a lot of people in the days and weeks after January 6th, there seemed to be a little sliver of light there that possibly Republicans were growing tired of Trump. I mean, you had the infamous Lindsey Graham Senate speech late in the evening of January 6th, where he kind of said, I've had it, it's been a good ride, but it's over kind of thing. And, McCarthy made similar speeches. And then, really the big turning point in my mind was when McCarthy a few weeks later went down to Mar-a-Lago and kind of posed for that photo embracing Trump. And, that seemed to kind of get him back on side and, created the conditions by which he ended up becoming speaker, as kind of like an ultra Trumper figure. I had a few weeks ago, I had Simon Rosenberg on the podcast, and he was talking about how he has optimism that we're only one election cycle away from the end of Trumpism, in the sense that if this is another kind of clear loss for Trump, not only the presidential election, but some of the candidates that he endorses lose, that could be, the end of him as kind of like the domineering force in the Republican Party. Do you think that, part of me thinks that maybe it's not quite so simple, but, how do you foresee the end of Trumpism happening? Is it ultimately a political, do you think it's a political outcome or more of a legal outcome? And, what does your research and scholarship kind of indicate in terms of when a party or even a country in some instances is captured by a strongman? How does something like this end?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And there's the example of Berlusconi where it was a democracy, but he didn't have a January 6th. So we're kind of in uncharted terrain, because a lot of the examples in my book where the dynamic is often that everybody around the strongman, all the Mark Meadows types, the Michael Flynn types, he's not mentioned on anything so far, unfortunately, they go to jail, but sometimes it takes a very long time to hold the actual leader, the inciter, to account. But a lot of those are real dictatorships. So here we have all of this unfolding in a democracy. So it's a little uncertain. The other thing is it's a very dynamic period right now, because it was quite indicative of something that these two Federalist Society-linked constitutional scholars just published this piece saying that Trump is ineligible to run because of the 14th Amendment, Section 3. That's kind of a big deal that the Federalist Society issued this, let's say. And there's also contradictory polling right now that, his base is still extremely fanatic. In fact, there's a very interesting poll from my point of view, total cult stuff. I don't remember who issued the poll, but it's recent, that said that people trust Trump more than they trust their family members. That's classic cult stuff. And that's what he's worked so hard to do. You have to have the loyalty has to be vertical, only the crowd and the leader, and not horizontal anymore. So you no longer trust your associates, your family, your friends, just upward to the leader. So there's that. But then there are other polls showing that, Trump is, that base is shrinking, and that a lot of independent or Republican leaning voters are getting tired of all of the legal stuff. And what happens to a party is it becomes kind of fossilized, because as you see with these candidates, like DeSantis, he started out as a Trump clone, a mini Trump. And so they can't really get beyond Trump. And so in DeSantis' case, he's trying to out-Trump Trump by becoming the most violent thug possible. Without Trump, we would not have a DeSantis who said, on day one, we're going to be slitting throats. Who says that? Who says that? The people I study, right. The Putins. Yeah. Putin talked about slitting throats, or these junta leaders. So that's where we are now. And then we have Vivek Ramaswamy, who is just openly, I was on a Twitter space that he was in. I was listening or lurking. And he was talking about, we need to rough it up. If he gets in, he's going to rough things up. He said, we got to break glass. And I was thinking, like January 6th, breaking glass. Right. So we've ended up with people, with the party becoming a reflection of Trump's thug values: violence, lying, corruption. Not that the party was pristine at all before. It's a racist, minoritarian, aspiring party. But the purpose of the autocrat is to bring everybody down to his level and make them complicit in his crimes and make them just as degenerate as he is. And Trump has done that very successfully.
Yeah, and just a note on that. I tweeted about this yesterday, that on Threads, I posted a clip of DeSantis saying that on day one, he's going to be shooting people at the border stone cold dead, which has become, he says this at all of his speeches now, but that actually got my account restricted. And I ended up appealing, and I can't even really blame Threads for that. I mean, that is incitement, but I'm just trying to cover the Republican primary, and this is the number 2 candidate. And so, as you were just talking about, I mean, it's really infected the whole party. I mean, in 2016, Trump was kind of this outlier, and now it's like all of the other candidates are trying to be him in that way.
They're all standing on Fifth Avenue and could shoot someone. I also thought with DeSantis, truly, he's losing no opportunity to be a thug rhetorically, because when the last arraignment Trump had, he was asked, which is, I'm sure was an annoying question for him, like, what did you watch the Trump arraignment? And what does he say? Here's the governor of a very large state, Florida, with lots of problems. And he says, I didn't watch it because I was busy overseeing an execution. So like right. Everything he's doing is him and violence. It's extremely disturbing.
Yeah. Exit question for you here as we wrap it up. There was a lot of talk, as I'm sure you're aware of, during Trump's presidency, kind of contextualizing him in this broader context of like global right-wing politics being ascendant. You had Brexit, Putin, obviously, Trump, Orban. And it feels like we've heard a little bit less of that. I mean, kind of for obvious reasons here in the States with Trump losing in 2020. And of course, this has not been a good set of years for Putin with the boondoggle in Ukraine. That was kind of senseless. That began at his instigation and has become a big mess and kind of destabilized things. What's your, this is a very like kind of broad question, but what's your assessment of how that struggle is going between the forces of democracy globally and these kind of right-wing authoritarianism, right-wing authoritarianism? Do you think that there has been some erosion of support and kind of strength on the authoritarianism side, or is that too simplistic of an analysis?
No, and I'm glad you asked that, because, and not just right-wing, if you look at what's going on in China and what will go on, there is a spread of authoritarianism. There are new candidates who are very skilled, who are young, like Bukele in El Salvador. So the threat is not, you could say it's still ascendant, but something else is happening, and it's not being covered by the media as such. But we're in the middle of a kind of global reaction against authoritarianism, because authoritarianism is being shown to be bankrupt. And things are happening that, like with Putin, this is why 2 days after he invaded Ukraine, I got a very familiar feeling from studying Mussolini, actually. And I wrote an MSNBC op-ed that said, you know what, this is not going to go well for him. And I'm not, Putin is in my book, but I'm not a career Russia specialist. Yeah. And it was because I realized he's got a kleptocracy. The whole society is ravaged by his corruption, and so is the military. So in his case, it's been the war on Ukraine that has shown people how bankrupt and corrupt it is. And then in Turkey, now Erdogan won his election, but just barely. And it was the earthquake that exposed the total corruption and cronyism that extended to the building industry. So that happened. And then in China, you have, it's very significant that those protests against the lockdowns, there were 79 universities that had protests. There's a whole new generation that is willing to protest that this is a new thing in China. And including Xi Jinping's alma mater, there was a protest there. So I'm tracking all of this. And there is something going on that is hitting at authoritarianism and exposing it. Now, our country has become like the latest front of this, dire struggle between autocracy and democracy. And so the reasons all these indictments and investigations are so important is that they can show Americans the corruption, the bad faith, the lying, also of Fox News, all the stuff that came out where, the Tucker Carlsons and Sean Hannitys are secretly saying, oh, we hate Trump. The election was not stolen. So we're also, it's like America is like a laboratory of this exposure. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully it will be sufficient save our democracy and not go the other direction.
Yeah, we'll see. And, as you were saying, Fox News, they were exposed as being extremely duplicitous in the Dominion lawsuit. And yet, it's, if you watch it, I mean, it's amazing that Trump gets as mad as he does about Fox, because 99% of the coverage is extremely favorable towards him. But, they'll have Bill Barr on there, and you'll say a few negative words about Trump, and it'll lead to an entire meltdown on Truth Social about how unfair Fox is. So, we'll see how that unfolds. I'm guessing the Wiggins will be circled if Trump winds up being the nominee, which seems kind of inevitable at this point. But Ruth, I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for spending part of your morning talking to me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of the Aaron Rupar Show drop every Thursday. Please like the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your circle. Thank you for tuning in.